What's the use no one's listening?
People don't listen when they're eating, but we play just the same. Isn't that so, sir?
They say it helps the digestion.
Exactly. That's because it soothes the nerves. Right, number 24.
Quickly! This way!
It's the end, boys. We've done our duty. We can go now.
Hertha! Komm doch schon! Wein nicht!
Arthur! Warte mich! Arthur!
Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel, the show where we dive into the wonderful world of music, look at things that are a bit different to the regular norm, right? And so in today's episode, I think we're going to be in for what I would describe as a bit of a dark and harrowing experience, but to be fair, it's also one that retains this incredibly bittersweet and melancholy beauty to it as it runs throughout this incredibly lengthy runtime. There's been a whole bunch of different versions of this album over the years since its inception back in 1969, I want to say. But this particular version is one that really resonates with me. I think it's a fantastic experimental album that just does so much, as well as just presenting this incredible story as well. And so, of course, we're looking at the wonderful work of Gavin Bryars, where they dive into the 2008 release of The Sinking of the Titanic in 1969. So of course, let's ask ourselves, who is Gavin Bryars? Well, Richard Gavin Bryars, is an English composer and double bassist who's performed within the works of jazz, minimalism, historicism, avant-garde, and of course experimental music. And across his career, Bryars has been involved in many different projects, with an absolute favourite of mine being his founding of the one and only Portsmouth Symphonia, which was an English orchestra whose purpose was to feature an entire ensemble of musicians playing instruments they didn't know how to play. And what you're left with is some of the most classic compositions being performed by what I can only describe as being the Springfield School Band. If you would like to know more though, check out Cactus Malpractice's video on the subject. This was my recommendation for his Worst Album Ever Made series because I thought it'd be really funny for him to dive into, and it's a very funny video, I'd say. Anyway, back to our video, which is going to be a lot more grim and depressing, to be fair. I do apologise, but back to Bryars though. So incidentally, this is one of Bryars' earliest and probably one of his most beloved works, in his entire career, I'd say. The Sinking of the Titanic, a composition based upon and inspired by the final moments of the band playing aboard the Titanic as it began to sink. And this composition, dating back to '69, has had a number of different releases, as we've mentioned, with the first official public release being a 1975 recording released on Brian Eno's Obscure Records as its first official release, which is quite fascinating, I would say. And so yeah, a number of different versions of this composition. We might look at some other versions in other videos, why not? I don't know for sure. But the version we're specifically looking at today is the collaborative version of The Sinking of the Titanic, featuring Alter Ego and the late Philip Jeck, released in 2008 on Touch Records. And this particular version was recorded at the 49th International Festival of Contemporary Music at Venice Biennale on the 1st of October 2005 at the Teatro Malibran. And it turns the original 20-minute composition into this fantastic 72-minute suite, flowing so beautifully throughout all these different movements, these motifs, these passages and concept, and so much. It tells this incredible story across this lengthy runtime. And so, considering how important to this version the contributions of the guest musicians are, we should of course ask ourselves two more questions. Who is Alter Ego? And who is Philip Jeck? And so starting with Alter Ego, this is the name of an Italian contemporary chamber music ensemble, consisting of around 11 or so members. It might be one of those revolving door kind of things, all playing a variety of different instruments and or objects on this particular recording, including bottles, tape recorders, percussion, violas, etc., etc. And this ensemble has contributed to so many different recordings over the years, including some under their own name, as well as through collaborations with the likes of Philip Glass and Alvin Lucier, as well as so many others, essentially. And then of course, moving on to, regrettably, the late Philip Jeck. Jeck was an English composer and multimedia artist whose compositions are noted for the utilization of antique turntables and vinyl records, along with looping devices. And Jeck has also contributed to so many recordings to the experimental label Touch, both as a solo artist and through collaborations. And so, with Bryars performing the double bass, Philip Jeck performing on the turntables, and Alter Ego ensemble performing their strings, brass, wind, percussion, keyboards, tape recorders, sound design, etc., 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 we're given a wholly different version of The Sinking of Titanic here. One that really delves into experimentalism, and yet it brings out so much weight and pathos to the recording itself, making it this incredibly emotional and cathartic journey, literally into the icy depths below. And so, let's dive into it, shall we? Opening the record, you're getting this incredibly peculiar crackle of vinyl, perhaps, before we're given this incredibly lengthy abstract experimental opener of peculiar effects, and it's fascinating to me. You get so much of this peculiar ambience opening up the record that makes it, a rather unsettling and downright ominous scene for us. It's as though, the tragedy is happening, or has happened, it's very interesting. It's like you're aboard the very ship itself, as it's all just existing and doing its thing, and then you have this looming danger coming in, if that makes sense. It's an incredibly slow-moving, whirling miasma of peculiar effects and tones, and it drifts on past for around roughly 12 minutes. And what I actually like, is this incredibly subtle shifting of drones and static, especially a bit later on into the 12 minutes. It's offset by this, rather peculiar ringing of some ship's mast, that kind of ringing of the bell affected by the wind just blowing through it, essentially, creating this very slow tempo, if that makes sense. And of course, it gives the entire composition this incredible presence of standing upon the very ship itself during those final moments, as the icy chill in the air, just traps your very breath as you feel this insurmountable fear just rising deep inside of you. And I would say it's almost overwhelming. But that's until you get introduced to what is, without a doubt, the main motif of this entire composition. And that is, when the Episcopalian hymn Autumn starts to play. A quick note here, though. There's actually some disparate opinions on what the song that was last played was aboard the Titanic. We're going to discuss that towards the end of the video. So for now, going forward, we're going to assume it was the hymn Autumn, as this composition utilizes it in particular for this entire experience. So, as soon as, those strings enter the scene, it gives us the hymn that forms the entire crux of Bryars' composition. And as it does, it's such a weird existential experience because the entire composition just starts descending with this incredibly melancholy weight and emotion. And I feel this is perhaps where the composition really opens up into its main concepts, where you're just given the most hauntingly beautiful requiem to play out for a little over an hour, I would say. It's an incredibly peculiar thing, but there's something so incredibly comforting and yet sad and haunting about this particular hymn as it plays out. It's unusual, but you feel the weight of emotion just literally pulling you down to beneath the very depths of the water itself. And as sad and terrible as it is, there is this incredibly odd existential sense of peace to it as you experience it, as though, you've come to your own understanding and acceptance of what is literally happening, and it's a kind of is what it is situation. There's nothing we can really do to save ourselves, and you kind of just have to sit back and let the entire thing happen. And it's peculiar because the more this one plays out, the more you just sit and contemplate everything that, was felt and experienced, if that makes sense. It's very unusual, and it's really tragic in its own weird way, but it's also so incredibly beautiful. And so what I like about this particular version, though, is the incredibly experimental nature of the composition that the musicians Philip Jeck and Alter Ego bring to the table, of course, You're getting this crackling of samples and electronics that create this very unusual sense of reality itself, as though you're literally wandering the very halls of the ships, seeing fractions of life happening as, this incredibly melancholy requiem continues to play. And for every instant of a sound effect, being it the tapping away of the machinery in the bowels of the ship itself, or the echoing rattle of little water droplets, it gives this composition this amazing sense of physicality and just a sense of existing within reality, as though it's really occupying that particular space and time, which of course is, in this instant, aboard the very ship during its final moments. And so, to be fair with this one, with this composition being so incredibly long at 72 minutes, there's so many different movements that happens as it occurs and stuff, so it's going to be kind of difficult to really dissect them all, but it's worth mentioning a couple of them. One particular point that is fascinating on this composition is when you're given a sample of an interview from what is believed to be one of the ship's survivors. This particular interview, it doesn't, to be fair, it doesn't actually regard all that much about what was happening to the ship itself during those, like what was literally happening, the fear and stuff. But the person being interviewed rather is just explaining the story of the orchestra itself, which, as we mentioned, played this requiem during the ship's final moments as it started to sink. And it's a very poignant piece of information, but there's something so oddly human about it as well. The orchestra, completely aware of their demise, spent their last moments doing the one thing that made sense to them at the time, which was continuing to play music. And I think there's something incredibly beautiful and tragic about the story, but there's something that I genuinely really love about it, though. Like, something so beautiful about this concept of, during what must be one of the most terrifying moments to experience in your life, finding comfort in music itself, and not just for your own soul, but for the souls of everyone aboard who could hear it, and just, during this thing, just hearing this beautiful music playing. Like, it's a very fascinating story, and it really interests me in this weird existential way. And so, the more this version of the composition is played, the much more abstract it becomes. But it continues the very subtle notion of expanding out the final 5 minutes of this hymn, morphing it subtly and slowly as the very descent towards the ocean bed just transforms it all entirely in this sort of, sub-level of sound hearing, if that makes sense, It's very interesting because although the performance was just of this 5 minutes, Bryars, Jeck, and Alter Ego have stretched it out to this 72-minute composition where it's like the whole thing is just echoing out slowly, amongst the very depths itself. There's a little point we'll mention later, actually, that goes back to that, actually, but put a pin in there as well. But as mentioned, I find there to be something so existential about it all, though. But it's perhaps the sheer beauty and power of this very composition, it's one that's so experimental in many ways, but yet it perfectly expresses the notions and ideas that Bryars wants to present so perfectly, I feel. And with it just pulls us along this incredibly melancholy journey into the icy depths. And the further and further you dive into this hour-long composition, the more heavy it becomes, the colder it becomes. And you're still given the faintest fragments of life and reality occurring, but it's all just being dragged further and further downwards. And so, interestingly, I find this kind of experimental composition to be really reminiscent of Everywhere at the End of Time by The Caretaker, which, much like that album, you're given this incredibly slow, almost degradation process as it just pushes it further and further until right towards the very end, you're just given these incredibly lo-fi rumbles where you're just, in this case, you'd just be encompassed by the water itself, And at everywhere at the end of time, you're just completely encompassed by confusion and chaos, essentially. To be fair, of course, the narratives between both albums are vastly different to each other, but weirdly enough, I feel the journeys themselves, especially when you're experiencing the albums, feel oddly similar to each other. I mean, of course, with Everywhere at the End of Time, that's 6.5 hours of experience. That's so much to deal with, essentially. And this is a little bit easier to digest, but still demanding at 72 minutes and stuff. But it's that almost same kind of concept of the degradation of music itself to create this existential experience, I feel. And so, before we close off and come to our conclusions and stuff, I think it's worth reading the text provided on the album's cover, and actually on the album's inside cover as well, or it might have been the back cover. There's a lot of text here, but it provides so much context that I think this will be quite interesting for us. And so, just to briefly go into it, the album's artwork for this specific version was designed by one John Wozencroft, co-founder of Touch in its early years in 1982, of course. And so with this minimalist cover, as you can no doubt see, it mostly consists of text, which we will get into a bit, of course. I think it's worth noting, though, the little picture of a boat aboard atop the top right here, with names adorned in various spots, and I couldn't find all that much information as to what these names are meaning and representing, and the relevance of it being positioned in these various spots on this boat, but I would imagine that there's something important here, but sadly couldn't find any info to tell us something concrete. So if you know, that would be lovely to let us know in the comments. In any case, the text, though, is of particular importance in giving us, all the necessary context and understanding for what it is we're hearing and experiencing, as well as some of the historical context for the story itself. And, it might just be me, but I find it interesting reading these things verbatim, as you know, and I find the whole story here to be very interesting. It's a very interesting story that just explains it a little bit better than I could. I can only really explain about what I'm feeling, but in terms of understanding the whole concept of this album, this will, do it justice, I feel. And so, there's a lot more text that was provided in the physical CD package than what's on the front cover. So we're going to read out the whole thing just to get all the necessary context and understandings. So, sit back and enjoy. On April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. in the North Atlantic and sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15th. Of the 2,201 people on board, only 711 were to reach their intended destination, New York. All the materials used in this piece are derived from research and speculations about the sinking of the unsinkable luxury liner. The initial starting point for the piece was the reported fact of the band, a small group of string players, having played a hymn in the final minutes of the ship's sinking in an extraordinarily noble act of self-sacrifice. In the various performing versions of The Sinking of the Titanic made since its inception in 1969, this has all involved the hymn tune Autumn, following the evidence of surviving wireless operator Harold Bride. He told the New York Times in April 1912. The band was still playing. I guess all of the band went down. They were playing Autumn then. I swam with all my might. I suppose I was 150 feet away when the Titanic, on her nose, with her after quarter sticking straight up in the air, began to settle slowly. The way the band kept playing was a noble thing, and the last I saw of the band when I was floating out in the sea with my lifebelt on, it was still on deck playing Autumn. How they ever did it, I cannot imagine. That and the way Phillips, the senior wireless operator, kept sending after the captain told him his life was his own, and to look out for himself, are two things that stand out in my mind over all the rest. As Walter Lord wrote, Bandmaster Hartley tapped his violin. The ragtime ended, and the strains of the episcopal hymn Autumn flowed across the deck and drifted in the still night far out over the water. The hymn tune was played between 2:15 and 2:20 a.m., the last 5 minutes of the sinking, and this unit becomes the building block for the music. The music can go through a number of different states, reflecting its slow implied descent into the ocean bed, which provides a range of echo and deflection phenomena, allied to considerable high-frequency reduction. Given the sealing effect of the water's surface and the greater efficiency of water as an acoustic medium, the music may continue indefinitely beneath the sea. This presupposes that the music was played as the water engulfed the ship, and, from Bride's account, there is no reason not to think this. Remember that the band were not only playing ultimately in water, but also with the ship standing almost perpendicular in the water for those last 5 minutes. Bride could not imagine how they ever did it, but we know that the band was playing outside the gymnasium doors, and these formerly vertical open doors would have become the horizontal floor that served as their last bandstand in the ship's vertical configuration. Apart from the equipment operated by two wireless officers, Phillips sending, Bryant receiving, there were other examples of the transmission and reception of acoustic signals. There is, for example, a technical illustration of an audio transducer attached to the hull of the ship, on the inside shell nestled against the ship's frame. This was to enable the ship to hear underwater bells which were attached to floating buoys out at sea along the east coast of Canada and the United States to warn of the approaching coast. The approaching iceberg was, of course, notoriously silent. It is impossible to underestimate the importance of the great Italian Guglielmo Marconi in the tragedy. Marconi had developed the principles of wireless telegraphy over great distances, and he had made the first transatlantic transmission of a single letter, the letter S, only 10 years early, from Bordeaux in Cornwall to St. John's in Newfoundland. This, however, was the first extensive use of wireless in ocean rescue, and the log of signals to and from the ship chronicled the whole progress of events. One of the survivors, drifting in the open sea, even expressed the somewhat mystical wish that they might be able to Marconi their gratitude to him from the lifeboat. And in fact, when Bride arrived in New York on the Carpathia, Marconi was waiting to rush on board and shake his hand. The prolongation of the music into eternity, however, it comes about from another scientific point of view. Towards the end of his life, Marconi became convinced that sounds, once generated, never die. They simply become fainter and fainter until we can no longer perceive them. Marconi's hope was to develop sufficiently sensitive equipment, extraordinarily powerful and selective filters, I suppose, to pick and hear these past faint sounds. Ultimately, he hoped to be able to hear Christ delivering the Sermon on the Mount. Curiously enough, one of the rescue ships, the Burma, received radio signals apparently originating from the Titanic 1 hour and 28 minutes after the ship had finally gone beneath the waves. It is perhaps fitting, therefore, that this recording of the sinking of the Titanic should have taken place in Marconi's native country, and moreover, in a live performance at the Teatro Malibran in one of the supreme aquatic environments, Venice. Curiously, this theatre was built on the site of the home of one of the world's greatest travellers, Marco Polo. It is perhaps the excerpt from the interview with Harold Bride that gives us the most context for this entire concept of recording, I feel, if I suppose you could call it. It's one that tells us so much of what inspired Bryars to produce such an emotionally heavy yet absurdly beautiful composition. And I don't know about you personally, but I generally find it all rather fascinating, especially the detail and understanding into the sort of longevity music has, or just sound itself. The concept of sound waves never disappearing entirely, but rather fading into minute obscurity, and yet, even regardless, still existing in some form. It sort of creates this sense of, things living beyond themselves. They live forever in some sense, and there's something truly beautiful and amazing about that. And for us, it gives, in terms of it being represented in this album, it gives the incredibly slow descent this entire composition has so much weight and emotion to it. An audio representation of this entire experience that it unfolded minute by minute, not just to the sinking, but even sinking right down to the seabed below, it seems. More importantly to me, though, is this concept of music, perhaps being this almost existential, otherworldly concept. The idea that it exists more than just the sound waves themselves. And so this will be a bit of a weird bit, but I'll try my best to explain my feelings as best I can. But music for me, more often than not, has always been this incredibly emotionally resonating thing that my soul just attaches itself to. And the sheer notion and idea that during a tragic oncoming demise that essentially led to the end of so many lives, it became punctuated by this 5-minute performance towards finality itself, letting music become this soothing balm for the soul. And I find it weird, very weird to think about. And especially the idea that, those sound waves themselves, as they, go into the depths below, just, ring out for this eternity into this quiet, minute detail, really, really peculiar. But there's something so incredibly melancholy, beautiful, and poignant about the very story itself, on this, very existential human level. And what amazes me is how Bryars has so abstractly managed to capture that incredibly existential notion that this very story, the concept and this composition itself entails as a whole now, on this very experimental version, has been presented to us in this very, engrossing and peculiar way that is emotionally resonating. And so, whilst the whole concept behind the project does fall under the mantle of Gavin Bryars, we should definitely be taking note of the contributions from both Alter Ego and the late Philip Jeck on this recording. I feel both musicians have lent so heavily on their own creative notions to bring out so much more to this concept, I feel, the peculiar abstract experimental ideas, the turntables and stuff, and experimentation, and then these disparate sound sources, bottles and rattlings and things like that, It gives this very peculiar sense of being aboard the very ship itself, hearing the murmuring and creaking at the many facets of it, bringing this unusual existential sense of reality itself, And out of the many versions that we have of the Sinking of the Titanic, I find this one to be my absolute favourite of them, which probably comes as no surprise to seasoned viewers of this show, as I love long-form experimental works, essentially. I just feel as though the collaborative efforts from everybody involved on this one has come together so brilliantly in presenting the sheer concept in this fresh and original way. And there's so many different movements across this 72-minute version that it is, like I've said, it's perhaps difficult for me to mention every single facet about every single part, but what I'm hoping is that enough of it has been presented here in this episode for you to go and check it out yourself, as is generally my intention with this show, because all I can do is present my opinion and understanding of my experience of particular music, but what interests me is how it then comes across to you, if that makes sense. And so, one final point before we close this one off. As mentioned, about the hymn Autumn playing as the final thing, the final hymn during the Titanic's final moments. In my research for this episode, I discovered there's actually a bunch of differing accounts on what the final song that was being played was. And so, as we know and understand, wireless operator Harold Bright asserts that the final performance was of the hymn Autumn, which, for this composition, forms the entire crux of it. However, many alternative perspectives state that the final hymn performed was actually Nearer My God to Thee. And this song is much more commonly associated with this legend, I suppose you could call it, to the point of it actually being included in many film adaptations, including the famous 1997 version with DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, of course, as well as the 1958 version, which we've been using clips of for in this very video. And so, with many different accounts, of this, it perhaps obscures the truth to the point of it being an urban legend of sorts, with the real truth being lost to the very depths themselves. But what I found it particularly interesting, though, just to sort of, I guess, further obfuscate this whole thing, is a statement stating that Nearer My God to Thee was apparently sung by the doomed crew and passengers of the SS Valencia as it sank off the Canadian coast in 1906. And there's perhaps a chance that this particular story of the Valencia inspired that of the Titanic legend, perhaps being an example of a tangling up of facts, if that makes sense, To be fair, I think it's perhaps a little bit irrelevant as to what song was playing in particular, because it's the sheer concept and idea of, performing a song during your final moments that makes the story so fascinating. And one that I've mentioned resonates with me in this incredibly human existential way. It also seems a fact that, Gavin Bryars was really taken by this entire story and of Harold Bride's particular account. And perhaps he utilises Autumn in his composition because it's the tune that resonates with him most. Of course, it's pure speculation at this point, but maybe worth thinking about. But regardless as well, what we have here is such a beautiful existential album experience that is truly phenomenal to behold. And so I think with that, we're going to come to the end of a rather long one of Weird Music again. There's been a bunch of these, I do apologise. Sometimes there's just an awful lot to talk about. In any case, this is an album I did want to discuss for quite some time on the channel since I first discovered it. I just simply never got around to articulating my thoughts. Must be an ADHD thing. But in any case, I'm glad to have shared this one with you today, as there's something so special and moving about this particular album, with everyone coming together in the name of expressing the core concept that Bryars had originally envisioned. And I have to say, I feel as though the work of the late Philip Jeck is particularly noteworthy on this recording. You know, perhaps one of my favourite recordings that he's been involved with that I've started listening to. I'll say here, it's a sad thing that I was a little bit late in discovering the wonderful world of Philip Jeck, but we will definitely discuss and discover more of his albums in future episodes, probably, maybe. In any case, this is a particular wonderful tragic album experience that I think will resonate with a lot of viewers out there who like, Disintegration Loops by Basinski, or the really tragic album The Infected Mass by Those Who Walk Away. You know, just these incredibly heavy resonating albums. And so with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best. Take care and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.